Welcome back and welcome to this introductory video for Module 3 of the Disarmament Orientation course. This module addresses some of the important structural issues that cut across the various disarmament treaties and regimes and affect their well-functioning. I will first speak with Silvia Mercogliano from the UDA Geneva branch about financing aspects related to multilateral disarmament accords. Next, Renata Dell'Acqua from UNIDIR will be discussing with Richard Lennon why gender issues are so important when dealing with disarmament. And last but not least, there's a really interesting conversation of Richard with Kathleen Lavant of the International Committee of the Red Cross on the relationship between international humanitarian law and disarmament. So let's get started. Hello again. In this short video, we speak to Silvia Mercogliano from ODA Geneva branch on the financial aspects of 4 UNODA-supported Geneva-based conventions. We're talking on the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. We refer to them as the APMBC, BWC, CCM, and CCW. So hello, Silvia. Can you tell us briefly why this is a matter that should concern disarmament diplomats in Geneva?
Hi, Oliver, and hello, everyone. These 4 conventions do not receive any funds from the regular budget of the United Nations. Instead, they are financed through extra budgetary contributions, which are assessed contributions by their states parties and or by the states parties that participate in their meetings. So if you are a state party to any of these conventions, or if you plan to attend any of these meetings, this video is relevant to you because we are talking of your government's money and of the services that you will get for them. This system of financing is called extra budgetary, and you will often hear that these conventions are funded through extra budgetary contributions. So these disarmament conventions are extra budgetary activities. This means that all the costs must be borne by the states parties to the conventions and the states not parties that participate in their meetings. The UN financial regulations and rules state that extra budgetary activities cannot involve additional financial liabilities for the organization, either directly or indirectly, without the approval of the General Assembly. To determine how much each state should pay, we use the United Nations scale of assessment, adjusted to take into account the difference in membership between the United Nations and the conventions. So among you, some states pay several thousand US, while others pay less than $100 a year.
So how does this work?
Well, the states parties to each of these 4 conventions approve a 1 year or a multiple years budget for each convention. This gives the Secretariat the authority to enter into contracts and incur expenditures during the agreed budget period. Now, on the basis of these approved budgets, the United Nations can cover the expenses related to the organization of the meetings, such as the documentation or the interpretation and the meeting services. For BWC and CCW, there are also costs associated with personnel, because these 2 conventions have implementation support units embedded in the UNODA Geneva. So the costs for these ISUs should cover the salary of 3 professionals in the case of BWC and 2 professionals in the case of CCW. For APMBC and CCM, the implementation support units of the conventions are not within the United Nations, and there are no personnel costs associated with their support from the United Nations side. There are, however, meeting costs. These costs are calculated before the meeting, and invoices are sent to states based on an estimate.
So where is the problem here?
Well, a certain number of states do not pay these preliminary invoices within 30 days or do not pay them at all. And between the preliminary and the final invoices, we have over $2 million of arrears waiting to be paid. So this is first and foremost a structural issue that pertains to the financing of the conventions, with the exception of BWC. This means that some states don't pay, and there is no mechanism in place to cover the unpaid debts, and the UN is left with the debt. This situation is obviously unsustainable, and we had to stop it. In 2019, the United Nations decided not to close the accounts of the conventions, with the exception of BWC, until all states pay their contributions for a given year. In cases where the United Nations did not have enough cash available to run the meeting, the meetings were cancelled or shortened. Other measures were also taken, such as the non-translation of the documents or the limitation of the number of languages in the interpretation of the meeting. And both of these measures, as you all know, go against the principle of multilingualism. And this was eminently a liquidity issue caused by late payments and the accumulation of unpaid contributions. So basically, we were in a situation where we had no money to enter into the commitments needed to make the meeting run smoothly as planned.
So what does the United Nations actually need?
So on the liquidity front, the United Nations needs to secure funds 3 months ahead of a meeting and needs to have these funds in the bank before contracting the interpreters, the conference officers, or entering into commitments for the translation of the documentation. A 15% contingency provision, such as the one under APMBC, would also help provide a liquidity buffer. In situations where staff contracts are concerned, sufficient cash needs to be on hand before the contracts can be extended. The United Nations also needs some medium-term financial visibility and the ability to plan on the basis of enough existing resources. Currently, we have staff on 3 or 3 months contracts in the CCW ISU due to a lack of funds.
So what do you think can be done?
Well, to provide cash to the secretariats to allow for the continuation of staff contracts in the cases where the ISUs are embedded in the United Nations, states could contribute to the working capital funds that have been created under both BWC and CCW. Also, states could move to a multi-year budget cycle so that the process of invoicing and paying is streamlined. In fact, having a multi-year budget allows advanced circulation of invoices before the start of the calendar year, which allows to enter the year with some cash already in the bank. States should also consider other measures to provide incentives to non-payers to pay in time and in full. Ultimately, with some financial rules that ensure the sustainability of the conventional machinery, there cannot be adequate support to the many activities that in principle states wish to have under these conventions. And I refer not only to the meetings of states parties, but first and more importantly, to universalization activities or all the necessary substantive and operational support that would be needed in the implementation of these conventions.
So if we look at the structural level, what does it mean to not close the accounts?
Well, current rules for the conventions, with the exception of BWC, require the United Nations to refund state parties the difference between the original estimated cost and the actual cost. So, on closing of the annual accounts, the UN must give full credit to those states that have paid in full. However, non-payment by some states means that the organization should in principle return funds, whether in the form of credit or in the form of cash, but still funds that it does not have. So this situation creates unfunded liabilities for the United Nations and contravenes the financial regulations and rules of the organization, which is why, to stop this process, in 2019, the United Nations decided that it would delay the closing of the accounts until all states have paid their contributions for a given year. This would avoid the UN being liable to give back to states money that it has not received. The collateral damage of this decision is that states that have paid their contribution in full and on time will not receive the credits that they would be entitled to receive, and this will be for some time to come. As I mentioned already a couple of times, this decision was not applied to the accounts of the Biological Weapons Convention because in this case, the states parties to the convention had adopted new and sustainable financial measures at the meeting of states parties that took place in 2018.
So what do you think can be done to address these issues?
To be able to comply with UN rules and regulations and return credits back to states, states parties to the three conventions could adopt financial measures similar to those adopted by the BWC states parties in 2018. That one, requested the United Nations to calculate the credits due to states parties that paid for a given financial year on the basis of the final cash balance, meaning the funds available at a specific time in the bank. Two, eventually request the United Nations to retain outstanding receivables at the original assessed level for states that have not paid their contributions. And three, request the United Nations to only return credits to those states that paid their contribution in full at the time of closing.
So what have you done so far?
Well, a number of things. Since 2015, UNODA, together with financial services, have started a dialogue with states to sensitize them to the financial difficulties faced by the conventions. Additional measures that have been taken were aimed at increasing the transparency of the process and give states greater visibility of the financial situation. So first we created a restricted web page that has a restricted access and on which we post on a monthly basis the status of contributions received for each convention. And on this web page, which has been recently redone and that goes by convention, we also post some important financial communications that pertain to the specific conventions. In addition to that, thanks to the work of finance colleagues and IT colleagues, a financial dashboard was launched. And the beauty of this dashboard is that it gives an immediate snapshot of the financial situation of each convention and tells the reader who among the states has paid its contributions and who is in arrears. And we continue, as UNODA, we continue to work with all stakeholders, including first and foremost the presidents of the respective conventions, to draft financial measures. This is, of course, the key to solving all issues highlighted above, and it is very much in your hands as member states. We can support, but it is for you to take important decisions.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for this short introduction on financial issues. Please note down your questions for the interactive part of the seminar. You can post these questions there, any comments you might have on the financial aspects of these and the other multilateral disarmament conventions, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, Silvia.
We're going to talk about gender, and I'm sitting here with Renata Dell'Acqua. Renata works at UNIDIR on gender issues, but tell us a little bit about your title and what you do, Renata.
Hi, I'm Renata Dell'Acqua, and I lead UNIDIR's Gender and Disarmament program. We work to support diplomats in bridging arms control and gender frameworks.
Well, I'm going to start by asking the question which I think a lot of people want to ask but maybe don't dare. And that is, what does it mean exactly when we say gender, when we talk about gender in disarmament diplomacy? What does that mean? What is gender?
So I think this is a really important question, Richard. The first thing I would like to say is that gender does not equal woman. So women and gender are not synonyms. When we talk about gender, we're actually talking about roles, responsibilities, behaviors, attributes associated with being a man or a woman, a girl or a boy or a non-binary person at a given time in a given context. So these are socially constructed characteristics that a society considers appropriate for a man or a woman. In this sense, they are not the same as biological sex, and they can be changed and they can evolve and throughout time and in different contexts. So in most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences and inequalities, and that's why we need to talk about gender equality. And that is why we talk about women's rights and roles, but the gender conversation should not only be about women alone.
If that's gender in general, let's talk now a little bit what it means for disarmament and arms control and international security.
So far, there have been two main ways of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament. The first one is the most common one, is to look at who's sitting at the table, and you will notice that they are mostly men. So diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament have throughout time been mostly men. Women are underrepresented in this field of diplomacy much more than in other fields, let's say human rights, social, cultural affairs. And we know that because we at UNIDIR, we have looked at the lists of participants of more than 80 multilateral meetings on arms control and disarmament, and we compiled the information about gender balance across different forums on arms control and disarmament, and it can be found in this publication. It's also on our website. What we learned is that women represent on average 30% of the diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament, and that goes from conventional weapons to weapons of mass destruction to security technology, let's say cybersecurity discussions. So that's across the board. The other thing we learned is that in smaller groups, let's say working groups or technical committees, the number of women is even less. It's even smaller, so women tend to comprise 20% of, when the delegations are smaller, when the country can only send one representative for an arms control negotiation, they most likely send a man. So in smaller settings, women are usually 20% of the diplomats, and that tells us something else. It tells us about the role women are occupying. They are not, the challenge is even bigger at leadership positions. So again, women as heads of delegations to arms control and disarmament negotiations, it's on average 20%. This means there is a lot that should be done and can be done in terms of bringing gender equality into arms control and disarmament. If we don't do anything at the rate of the current pace, it will take 2 decades to reach gender parity at the working level, and only in 2065 we calculated that's when we would have gender balance among heads of delegations. So this means taking targeted action to give women more speaking roles, making sure women get a chance to participate and shape the outcomes of the conversations and deliberations. So this is, like we say, track 1 of bringing gender into arms control. It's to look at representation, participation, and meaningful participation. The second way of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament is actually what we call applying a gender lens to the substance of the discussion. So it's to look at how gender roles, gender norms, attributes can impact women and men in a certain context, in the context of armed violence and conflict. For instance, if gender identity leads you to, I don't know, puts you at more risk or influence how you're gonna access medical help, medical care, or it changes the way you'll be targeted by a certain weapon system or not. So this is what UNIDIR does. We do research to understand gender dynamics and in context of armed violence and conflict, and how that can be translated into arms control measures. And this may seem kind of a novel approach, but actually it has been done for some time already. A good example of bringing gender into arms control is the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty. So based on the knowledge that we have, that actually men are the largest proportion of direct casualty of small arms, but actually women are impacted by gender-based violence facilitated by such arms. So based on this knowledge, negotiators included a clause in the ATT mandating that states parties assess the risk that exported material will be used to facilitate gender-based violence. And this is one example, but if you look also at the action plans of the Mine Ban Treaty, the Cluster Munition Convention, the Treaty on the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition, they all have clauses mandating gender-sensitive assistance. And if you look also at the first committee resolutions, we have seen an increasing number of resolutions, including gender language. Last year, we estimate that a third of the resolutions adopted contained gender-relevant language.
How does gender relate to arms control and disarmament? Gender refers to the attributes that a society considers the norm for women and men, girls and boys, as well as non-binary or gender-fluid persons. In most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences and thus inequalities. When it comes to international forums concerned with peace and security, women are frequently underrepresented. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council approved a resolution that called for increased participation of women in peace and security decision-making. Nearly 20 years later, women make up only a third of the diplomats in arms control and disarmament forums. Still, there is hope. In 2018, the United Nations Secretary-General's Agenda for Disarmament called for the equal participation of women and men in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security. Women as well as men have the right to shape the outcomes of decisions that will affect their lives. But we must go beyond representation alone and ensure women can meaningfully influence decision-making. The truth is, gender norms shape how weapons are seen and used in society, as well as the impacts of weapons and violence. By applying a gender lens, we can begin to see how arms control and disarmament affect all segments of the population differently. Gender analysis is growing in recognition and has already inspired multilateral actions through a number of treaties and resolutions. UNIDIR is committed to gender equality as a key instrument of peace and security. Help us effectively integrate gender perspectives in disarmament discussions so we can ensure that everyone's security needs are properly addressed and make gender equality a reality for all.
Some very interesting ideas in there. I guess one question some people may have is, why does it matter? And coming back to track one, and you say the name of the report is still behind the curve, that the rate of participation of women in disarmament diplomacy is much lower than perhaps other areas of multilateral diplomacy. Why does that matter, and why is it important for us as diplomats?
So I'll give you three main reasons. The first one is connected to what I was saying before, is that knowledge of gender dynamics and gender disaggregated data can actually be translated into practical arms control measures and can make arms control more effective and help arms control and disarmament redress gender inequalities in the context of armed violence and conflict. The second question, it's because it's a matter of equality. It's a recognition that women and men have the same right to participate and shape the outcomes of decisions in any given area of policy or diplomacy, and arms control and disarmament is one of that area. And the third point is that that gender issues have been quite high on the public agenda in the media and have, featured in many mobilizations we've seen recently, the Me Too movement and more action towards gender equality. So I think also bringing gender into arms control and disarmament has the potential to engage more the general public. We often hear, people are not interested in arms control and disarmament, what should we do? And I think that actually can serve as a hook to bring more people on board, get the general public interested and engaged in arms control matters.
Well, looking across the whole range of disarmament work that we do here in Geneva, obviously it's a big area, and as you've explained, gender comes into it in all kinds of different ways. So what areas is UNIDIR and the gender program going to focus on over the next year?
So yes, we try to assist member states at all arms control forums. So we cover the whole spectrum of arms control and disarmament discussions. When we have to prioritize, this year we have two processes underway on cybersecurity. You have an open-ended working group and a GGE. So UNIDIR is actually conducting research to inform gender approaches to cybersecurity, trying to identify specific issues of the cyber domain that could benefit from a gender analysis. For instance, online harassment, access to technology, or gender-sensitive capacity building in the cyber realm. So this is one big part of our current program. The other thing is that in 2020, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is celebrating 20 years. October will mark 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. So UNIDIR is actually conducting research to identify concrete examples of where arms control and the Women, Peace and Security agenda intersect, how arms control measures can advance not only women's participation, but also prevention and protection of sexual and gender-based violence, and relief and recovery in the aftermath of conflict. So this is something that you should expect will come out October this year. In addition to that, we are always conducting gender briefings related to discussions that are happening in Geneva, but also in New York, Vienna, and in The Hague. We did some, we published research in addition to Still Behind the Curve. We have research on specific examples of how gender dynamics interfere with weapons. So I have here this one, it's called Missing Links, and it's about gender impacts of chemical and biological weapons, for instance. And all of our work and our publications can be found at the UNIDIR Gender and Disarmament Hub. It's a dedicated corner of our website which has publications, information, and also ideas for action to bring gender into arms control and disarmament.
So lots going on. This course is for diplomats, especially for new diplomats in Geneva who are going to be working on disarmament. What can they do? I mean, if I'm a diplomat, I'm starting work on disarmament in Geneva, what can I do on gender?
So I can tell you what we've heard from diplomats themselves, telling us how they bring gender into their everyday work. So some of them told us they pay attention to the composition of panels, of committees. When they report back to Capital, they include information about men and women participation, who got to speak, track this type of thing. They actually praise gender-balanced panels when reporting back to Capital. They adopt a policy of declining invitations to single-sex panels. So just this awareness of gender equality, translated into everyday action. This is one thing that diplomats can do. The other is to engage with gender analysis, to learn, develop gender expertise, which will be relevant to your posting here on arms control and disarmament, but will also be relevant to other posts you might take further in your career. So we actually encourage diplomats to engage with gender analysis and build gender expertise. A third thing that diplomats can do is to engage with the Disarmament Impact Group. It's a group that UNIDIR is one of the co-chairs, so we are always available to provide briefings and support member states in bringing gender into the agenda of the discussion, actually. So this is something else that diplomats can do. They can request a briefing, put gender in the agenda, or participate in a side event, organize a side event on gender and the topic being discussed. Yes, and UNIDIR is here to support. If you're a diplomat interested in bringing gender into arms control, please do reach out.
So if diplomats interested in learning more about what they could do or how they could work with UNIDIR and with the Disarmament Impact Group, they can come and see you here at UNIDIR.
Definitely.
All right. So everyone, thank you, Renata. I'm sure people will be coming to see you, but thank you very much for sharing this information with us today. I'm at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I'm speaking to Kathleen Lawand, who's head of the Arms Unit here. Kathleen, thanks very much for joining us to contribute to the course. Perhaps we could start if you just tell us, what is the ICRC?
Well, that's a very good question. The ICRC has been around for a very long time, 157 years. We're a neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian organization. We're mandated, notably under the Geneva Conventions, to protect and assist the victims of armed conflict. That is, persons who are made vulnerable and affected by armed conflict. So we think principally of civilians, but it also involves wounded soldiers, captured soldiers, prisoners of war, and other persons who are protected basically by international humanitarian law. That is the law of armed conflict or the laws and customs of war. So the ICRC is often referred to as the guardian of international humanitarian law due to our special role under the Geneva Conventions to protect and assist the victims of armed conflict. And most of our work is done in the field, so we are present in over 90 countries worldwide. Many of these countries are suffering from armed conflict, warfare, or other situations of violence. And the ICRC is present with its delegates in the field to indeed try to alleviate the suffering of the victims of armed conflict there. And this involves also a dialogue with all of the parties to the armed conflict, that is, those that are fighting these wars. It could be government armed forces, it could be non-state armed groups. We don't distinguish, we speak to all sides of an armed conflict in accordance with our neutrality and impartiality. And one of the things we're saying to these conflict parties is that they should be respecting the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. So we remind them of their obligations to respect and ensure respect by their forces, the laws of armed conflict. We also endeavor to prevent suffering by engaging in a dialogue, and this is the work that we do here in Geneva, engaging in a dialogue with states and other stakeholders to promote the strengthening or clarification or even development of new rules of international humanitarian law. And this could be in instances where we see that there are gaps in protection in the field, so that the law perhaps is not clear, perhaps there are new issues arising, new forms of armed conflict arising. For example, warfare today is moving more and more into populated areas, so this is raising questions about how conflict parties are interpreting and applying the rules of international humanitarian law when they're conducting warfare in densely populated areas, concentrations of civilians, etc. So this is raising questions about how these rules, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, proportionality in attack, how is all of that being interpreted and faithfully implemented in urban warfare? So the new types of warfare that are raising questions about how these rules should be complied with. So we have, new types of conflict that arise and raise questions about the interpretation and faithful implementation of IHL. But then there's also the question that arises when new weapons are being developed, new technologies of warfare. And these new technologies may raise significant questions about how existing rules of IHL apply to these new technologies. So there could be major challenges applicable there. We're looking at that in particular in relation to autonomous weapon systems. What happens when a human is no longer involved in the selection and attack of targets? This raises unique questions and challenges under existing international humanitarian law. So it begs the question, well, is there a need to clarify existing law or develop new rules to address these challenges? And this is how the ICRC has been working for the last, basically since it was founded 157 years ago, and where we work both in the field and alleviating suffering, bringing protection and assistance to victims of armed conflict in the field, but also based on what we witness in the field. So the evidence of the effects of armed conflict, we bring this evidence to states to say, hey, there may be a need here to clarify or strengthen existing rules of IHL.
You've explained how ICRC is seen as the guardian of international humanitarian law and how the work it does in support of IHL and creating new IHL. But what exactly is international humanitarian law? Can you tell us what it is, what it consists of, where it comes from, and how it's developed?
Well, international humanitarian law is the body of international law that seeks to alleviate human suffering in armed conflict. So it applies in an armed conflict, be it an international, that is interstate conflict, or a non-international armed conflict. So a conflict that opposes a state against non-state armed groups or non-state armed groups between themselves. So in all of these situations, the law of armed conflict, that is international humanitarian law, basically seeks to protect persons who do not or no longer participate in the hostilities. So this is principally civilians, but it could also be soldiers that are out of combat because they are wounded, or soldiers that are captured, etc. So persons who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities are protected by IHL. In addition to that, IHL contains a series of rules that aim to limit the effects of hostilities, of the conduct of hostilities. So basically, these rules constrain the choice and use of means and methods of warfare, and this includes weapons, of course. And this is where there is an intersection with arms control and disarmament, of course, because IHL seeks for humanitarian reasons to limit the use of certain weapons. It even goes a step further and even prohibits the use of certain weapons when their effects are unacceptable from a humanitarian point of view. So this includes, for example, and now I'm referring to key rules of IHL in the conduct of hostilities, which constrain the choice of means and methods of warfare, weapons that fall foul of the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks. So attacks that are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilian objects without distinction. So these would be, this is a key rule that constrains the use of weapons. Now, weapons that are of an indiscriminate nature could be that way either because you cannot direct the weapon at a specific military objective, or because the effects of the attack escape the control of the user. That is, they cannot be limited as required by international humanitarian law. Another key rule that constrains the use of weapons in warfare is the prohibition to use means of warfare that are of a nature to cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. So this is suffering in excess of what is required to achieve lawful objectives in warfare. So in excess of what would be required to neutralize enemy soldiers. Each of these rules contain a careful balance and a very pragmatic balance between the principles of humanity and humanitarian aims and military necessity. So IHL is a very pragmatic body of law that takes into account military needs as well. And then finally, there's another group of rules that aim to protect the environment, notably the rule that prohibits means of warfare that are of a nature to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. And all of these rules put together create a framework of IHL. These are the general rules of IHL that constrain the use of weapons in warfare. Now, these rules are found mainly in the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions that were adopted in 1977, but they are also codified and consecrated in customary international law. What's important to note is that international humanitarian law tells us that there are limits to warfare. There's no such thing as wars without limits. There are limits that exist through these general rules, and then states over the years have actually provided specific prohibitions and limitations to certain weapons through treaties that they have adopted. So, for example, the use of chemical and biological weapons was prohibited already in the late 19th century through certain treaties, and then comprehensively prohibited in 1972 with the Biological Weapons Convention, and then in 1993 with the Chemical Weapons Convention. Anti-personnel mines were prohibited in 1997. One of the things that is important to note as well is that these general rules of IHL that I've just mentioned, any weapon, the lawfulness of any weapon can be judged against these rules. In other words, you don't need a specific treaty to prohibit or eliminate specific weapons.
So if I've understood what you're saying, Kathleen, you have these kind of three areas of IHL, but it all revolves around kind of controlling the way that war is conducted. And you've explained that the value of IHL is that it has this very important and pragmatic balance between the sort of military objectives and utility and then the humanitarian concerns. How does this then relate to what we're doing in disarmament, where we do have treaties on specific weapons? We do see I mean, the participants in this course, who are diplomats here in Geneva, will see the ICRC delegation at the meetings and conferences that they go to. I mean, what is then the connection? What is ICRC doing in disarmament, and how is it linking these two areas together?
Well, the ICRC's work traditionally in disarmament has been very much based on what it has seen in the field in armed conflicts in terms of the actual effects of weapons in the field. So we've taken traditionally an effects-based or evidence-based approach to weapons. How are they actually affecting civilians, combatants in the field? What are their impacts, their humanitarian impacts when used in armed conflict? And it's what we've witnessed in armed conflicts, when we've witnessed patterns of harm to civilians or the effects on human health in terms of their impacts on combatants or their effects on the environment. And when we've seen that these effects have been really unacceptable, this is when we have brought this to the attention of states and asked them to take measures to limit or even prohibit the use of certain weapons.
So this is what's motivating, for example, the ICRC's contribution to getting the CCW
Absolutely.
Established and
Exactly.
then expanded, and the Anti-Personnel Mine Convention and
Absolutely.
Cluster Missions. And most recently, I guess, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You've also been contributing
That's right.
Information and studies on the effects of these weapons.
Absolutely. So, for example, we were in Hiroshima in 1945. We just commemorated the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, the ICRC was the first international humanitarian organization to arrive at Hiroshima. This was 2-3 weeks after the atomic bomb, and we witnessed a scene beyond imagination. And there were still tens of thousands of wounded people. Over 100,000 people had been killed in the atomic bombing. And what we witnessed as well is that humanitarian organizations just could not provide adequate humanitarian assistance. This was completely beyond our capabilities, given the colossal scale of the needs created by the nuclear detonation and the long-term impacts of radiation exposure, with people falling ill and dying months and years after the atomic bombing. And this is what drove us to call for a ban on nuclear weapons. We called for nuclear weapons to be outlawed already in September 1945, and since then we've been regularly calling for the ban on these weapons. I could also mention, as yet another example, is our work on anti-personnel mines. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, ICRC doctors were documenting what they called, in clinical terms, an epidemic of death and injury of civilians from the use of anti-personnel mines in conflicts around the world. In virtually all the conflicts where anti-personnel mines were used, this led to massive civilian death and injury. These weapons blindly struck whoever may step on them, be it a soldier or civilian. And having documented the devastating effects on civilians over decades, in the mid-1990s, the ICRC called for a ban on anti-personnel mines because these weapons were clearly unacceptable. Our call for a ban on these weapons was very much based on, indeed, the evidence of what we saw in the field. So it's this effects-based approach that I described and that we take.
So we could say then that what the ICRC brings to the arms control and disarmament sphere, if you like, is two things. First, its role as custodian of international humanitarian law, so you can provide the analysis and the assessment of what a new weapon or what a new situation might mean in terms of existing IHL. And also you bring this very thorough amount of effects-based evidence, what is happening with these weapons in the field in reality, what effects are they causing.
Right.
So, I mean, is this what I guess our colleagues could expect from the ICRC delegation at any particular negotiation or conference, that these are the perspectives you'll be bringing?
Absolutely. We will bring, again, as I said, we will bring an evidence-based or effects-based approach. So what are the foreseeable impacts that this weapon will have when they're used in armed conflict? And this will be based on what we see ourselves in theaters of armed conflict where we are present. Well, what we've seen in the last decades, especially the last 30 years, I would say, is really an exponential development of treaties that prohibit or limit the use of certain weapons, but based on humanitarian considerations. It's what some stakeholders call humanitarian disarmament. And this is where there is an important intersection between traditional disarmament and arms control approaches, that is, that aim to not just ban weapons, but include requirements to disarm the weapon, so destroy stockpiles of weapons and so on, and combining that with humanitarian action, as it were, to protect civilians from the effects of these weapons. So mine clearance, bans on use of the weapons because the use of the weapon would fall foul of general rules of international humanitarian law, in particular weapons that may have indiscriminate effects and so on. So this is a trend that we've seen, I would say, over the last 2-3 decades, and that has been combined, for example, in the prohibition on anti-personnel mines and the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So these treaties, which didn't just ban the weapon because of their humanitarian impacts, these treaties included disarmament requirements, so requirements to actually eliminate completely the weapon. And that has been a very, I would say, positive development which has affected a convergence, in a sense, between IHL, International Humanitarian Law, and disarmament law. Now, interestingly, these treaties have been, be it the ban on, as I said, anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions, the ban, for example, on blinding laser weapons, also in the mid-1990s. So these were weapons that were designed to deliberately blind enemy combatants. These weapons were banned because they were deemed cruel weapons and unacceptable. So all of these prohibitions and limitations, for example, on incendiary weapons in Protocol 3 of the CCW, so which prohibits the use of air-launched incendiary weapons against military objectives located in populated areas. So these prohibitions and limitations are based either on the IHL prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, so to do away with indiscriminate weapons that are of a nature to strike military targets and civilian objects without distinction, or banning the weapon because it is cruel, it causes excessive suffering, so the example of blinding laser weapons. So these two fundamental rules of IHL have grounded these treaties prohibiting or limiting certain weapons. But beyond that, we also have an important treaty that has an important humanitarian driver, and that's the Arms Trade Treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty, which aims to impose certain limits on the arms trade, prohibits arms transfers where there would be a certain level of risk that violations of IHL will occur. So the Arms Trade Treaty aims to prohibit arms transfers where there is an overriding risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law, or for that matter of human rights, occurring.
So in a way the ATT is kind of preemptively reinforcing IHL.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the idea there is to prevent arms falling into the hands of those who would use them to commit serious violations of IHL or of human rights.
As you've mentioned, there's a formidable amount of expertise in the ICRC on IHL and related matters. I guess you and your colleagues are available to help course participants. What can you offer?
So if there are any questions about IHL and how it applies to weapons, participants could refer to the arms unit in the ICRC. We have also developed some tools to help people who want to learn more about IHL. We've developed an app, the ICRC has developed an app on IHL treaties that I would encourage participants to download and use. And it contains all of the treaties, the IHL treaties that apply to weapons, that limit or prohibit the use of certain weapons. We've also developed an online course on IHL, which also could be extremely useful and helpful for the course participants.
That was our video for Module 3. So please keep these cross-cutting issues in mind as we now dive deeper into the specific and substantive disarmament issues. Next up, in Module 4, we will be discussing conventional weapons. I look forward to seeing you there.